Hello, this is Let's Talk About Myths, baby. And I am your host, Liv. So today, because Tuesday's episode was that incredible conversation with Eric H. Klein, I thought I would bring you something a little simpler today. It was going to be just a regular reading episode continuing on with the fall of Troy, but then, see, all the episodes we've just done on the Bronze Age, all those narrative episodes I gave you, just with the brief details, the brief history of those, I was really drawn in to the Thucydides quotes that Michaela had added in to all of those research scripts. Thucydides is not ever a source that I have used before because I love my mythology, and he wrote, this history of the Peloponnesian War, this war between Athens and Sparta / this war basically between all of Greece. And, so I've never really dove into his work, but learning that the opening chapter to Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War is actually a kind of cultural memory of the Bronze Age. I've been using that phrase so often, it will continue to be used, but the fact that it looks at the Homeric history, quote-unquote history, presented in the Iliad and the Odyssey and other mythos of the ancient Greeks, and presents it as this kind of historical background for the founding of Greece and, how it eventually led to the city-states that Thucydides was writing in the 5th century. It was just utterly fascinating to me that he had written all of this as their kind of acknowledged history. So, since we have gone through this sort of archaeological, that our knowledge of the Bronze Age history as modern people, since we've spent a month going through that, I thought we would cap things off with a reading of an ancient Athenian, a classical Athenian, so Thucydides, someone writing nearly 1,000 years after the height of Mycenae. I thought we would look at how someone like that, someone living in that time in Athens, this time that is so ancient to us, but compared to the Bronze Age is not so ancient at all, look at how someone living through that saw the Bronze Age history. So I'm going to just read this section, this sort of opening of Thucydides' history, and we can all just really dive into this idea of how they saw their own history. I just think it's an absolutely fascinating way of looking at both the mythology that I love so much and the Bronze Age and just how these things interacted in the ancient world. This is a selection from Book 1 of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War from 431 BCE, translated by Richard Crawley. Thucydides, an Athenian, wrote the history of the war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians, beginning at the moment that it broke out and believing that it would be a great war and more worthy of relation than any that had preceded it. This belief was not without its grounds. The preparation of both the combatants were in every department in the last state of perfection, and he could see the rest of the Hellenic race taking sides in the quarrel, those who delayed doing so at once having it in contemplation. Indeed, this was the greatest movement yet known in history, not only of the Hellenes, but of a large part of the barbarian world. I had almost said of mankind, for though the events of remote antiquity, and even those that more immediately preceded the war, could not from lapse of time be clearly ascertained, yet the evidences which an inquiry carried as far back as was practicable leads me to trust all point to the conclusion that there was nothing on a great scale either in war or in other matters. For instance, it is evident that the country now called Hellas had in ancient times no settled population. On the contrary, migrations were of frequent occurrence, the several tribes readily abandoning their homes under the pressure of superior numbers. Without commerce, without freedom of communication either by land or sea, cultivating no more of their territory than the exigencies of life required, destitute of capital, never planting their land, for they could not tell when an invader might not come and take it all away, and when he did, they had no walls to stop him. Thinking that the necessities of daily sustenance could be supplied at one place as well as another, they cared little for shifting their habitation, and consequently neither built large cities nor attained to any other form of greatness. The richest spoils were always most subject to this change of masters, such as the district now called Thessaly, Boeotia, most of the Peloponnese, Arcadia excepted, and the most fertile parts of the rest of Hellas. The goodness of the land favored the aggrandizement of particular individuals, and thus created faction which proved a fertile source of ruin. It also invited invasion. Accordingly, Attica, from the poverty of its soil enjoying from a very remote period freedom from faction, never changed its inhabitants. And here is no inconsiderable exemplification of my assertion that the migrations were the cause of there being no correspondent growth in other parts. The most powerful victims of war or faction from the rest of Hellas took refuge with the Athenians as a safe retreat, and at an early period becoming naturalized, swelled the already large population of the city to such a height that Attica became at last too small to hold them, and they had to send out colonies to Ionia. There is another circumstance that contributes not a little to my conviction of the weakness of ancient times. Before the Trojan War, there is no indication of any common action in Hellas, nor indeed of the universal prevalence of the name. On the contrary, before the time of Hellen, son of Deucalion, no such appellation existed, but the country went by the name of the different tribes, in particularly of the Pelasgian. It was not till Hellen and his sons grew strong in Phthiotis and were invited as allies into other cities that one by one they gradually acquired from the connection the name of the Hellenes, though a long time elapsed before that name could fasten itself upon all. The best proof of this is furnished by Homer. Born long after the Trojan War, he nowhere calls of them by that name, nor indeed any of them except the followers of Achilles from Phthiotis, who were the original Hellenes. In his poem they are called Danaans, Argives, and the Achaeans. He does not even use the term barbarian, probably because the Hellenes had not yet been marked off from the rest of the world by one distinctive appellation. It appears, therefore, that the several Hellenic communities comprising not only those who first acquired the name city by city as they came to understand each other, but also those who assumed it afterwards as the name of the whole people, were, before the Trojan War, prevented by their want of strength and the absence of mutual intercourse from displaying any collective action. Indeed, they could not unite for this expedition till they had gained increased familiarity with the sea, and the first person known to us by tradition as having established a navy is Minos. He made himself master of what is now called the Hellenic Sea, and ruled over the Cyclades, into most of which he sent the first colonies, expelling the Carians and appointing his own sons governors, and thus he did his best to put down piracy in those waters, a necessary step to secure the revenues for his own use. For in early times, the Hellenes and the barbarians of the coast and islands, as communication by sea became more common, were tempted to turn pirates, under the conduct of their most powerful men, the motives being to serve their own cupidity and to support the needy. They would fall upon a town unprotected by walls and consisting of a mere collection of villages and would plunder it. Indeed, this came to be the main source of their livelihood. No disgrace being yet attached to such an achievement, but even some glory. An illustration of this is furnished by the honor with which some of the inhabitants of the continent still regard a successful marauder, and by the question we find the old poets everywhere representing the people as asking of voyagers, "Are they pirates?" As if those who are asked the question would have no idea of disclaiming the imputation, or their interrogators of reproaching them for it. the same rapine prevailed also by land. And even at the present day, many of Hellas still follow the old fashion. The Azolian Locrians, for instance, the Aetolians and the Arcanians in that region of the continent. And the custom of carrying arms is still kept up among those continentals from their old piratical habits. The whole of Hellas used once to carry arms, their habitations being unprotected and their communication with each other unsafe. Indeed, to wear arms was as much part of everyday life with them as with the barbarians. And the fact that the people in these parts of Hellas are still living in the old way points to a time when the same mode of life was once equally common to all. The Athenians were the first to lay aside their weapons and to adopt an easier and more luxurious mode of life. Indeed, it is only lately that their rich old men left off the luxury of wearing undergarments of linen and fastening a knot of their hair with a tie of golden grasshoppers, a fashion which spread to their Ionian kindred and long prevailed among the old men there. On the contrary, a modest style of dressing, more in conformity with modern ideas, was first adopted by the Lacedaemonians, the rich doing their best to assimilate their way of life to that of the common people. They also set the example of contending naked, publicly stripping and anointing themselves with oil in their gymnastic exercises. Formerly, even in the Olympian contests, the athletes who contended wore belts across their middles, and it is but a few years since the practice ceased. To this day, among some of the barbarians, especially in Asia, when prizes for boxing and wrestling are offered, belts are worn by the combatants. And there are many other points in which a likeness might be shown between the life of the Hellenic world of old and the barbarian way of today. With respect to their towns, later on, at an era of increased facilities of navigation and a greater supply of capital, we find the shores becoming the site of walled towns, and the isthmuses being occupied for the purposes of commerce and defense against a neighbor. But the old towns, on account of the great prevalence of piracy, were built away from the sea, whether on the islands or the continent, and still remain in their old sites. For the pirates used to plunder one another, and indeed all coast populations, whether seafaring or not. The islanders, too, were great pirates. These islanders were Carians and Phoenicians, by whom most of the islands were colonized, as was proved by the following fact. During the purification of Delos by Athens in this war, all the graves in the island were taken up, and it was found that above half their inmates were Carians. They were identified by the fashion of the arms buried with them, and by the method of interment, which was the same as the Carians still follow. But as soon as Minos had formed his navy, communication by sea became easier, as he colonized most of the islands, and thus expelled the malefactors. The coast population now began to apply themselves more closely to the acquisition of wealth, and their life became more settled. Some even began to build themselves walls on the strength of their newly acquired riches. For the love of gain would reconcile the weaker to the dominion of the stronger, and the possession of capital enabled the more powerful to reduce the smaller towns to subjection. And it was at a somewhat later stage of this development that they went on the expedition against Troy. What enabled Agamemnon to raise the armament was more, in my opinion, his superiority in strength than the oaths of Tyndareus, which bound the suitors to follow him. Indeed, the account given by those Peloponnesians who have been the recipients of the most credible tradition is this. First of all, Pelops, arriving among a needy population from Asia with vast wealth, acquired such power that, stranger though he was, the country was called after him, and this power fortune saw fit, materially, to increase in the hands of his descendants. Eurystheus had been killed in Attica by the Heraclids. Atreus was his mother's brother, and to the hands of his relation, who had left his father on account of the death of Chrysippus, Eurystheus, when he set out on his expedition, had committed Mycenae and the government. As time went on and Eurystheus did not return, Atreus complied with the wishes of the Mycenaeans, who were influenced by fear of the Heraclids. Besides, his power seemed considerable, and he had not neglected to court the favor of the populace, and assumed the scepter of Mycenae and the rest of the dominions of Eurystheus. And so the power of the descendants of Pelops came to be greater than that of the descendants of Perseus. To all this Agamemnon succeeded. He had also a navy far stronger than his contemporaries, so that, in my opinion, fear was quite as strong an element as love in the formation of the Confederate expedition. The strength of his navy is shown by the fact that his own was the largest contingent, and that of the Arcadians was furnished by him. This, at least, is what Homer says, if his testimony is deemed sufficient. Besides, in his account of the transmission of the scepter, he calls him of many an isle and of all Argos king. Now, Agamemnon's was a continental power, and he could not have been master of any except the adjacent islands, and these would not be many, but through the possession of a fleet. And from this expedition we may infer the character of earlier enterprises. Now, Mycenae may have been a small place, and many of the towns of that age may appear comparatively insignificant, but no exact observer would therefore feel justified in rejecting the estimate given by the poets and by tradition of the magnitude of the armament. For I suppose if Lacedaemon were to become desolate, and the temples and the foundations of the public buildings were left, that as time went on there would be a strong disposition with posterity to refuse to accept her fame as a true exponent of her power. And yet they occupy 2/5 of the Peloponnese and lead the whole, not to speak of their numerous allies without. Still, as the city is neither built in a compact form, nor adorned with magnificent temples and public edifices, but composed of villages after the old fashion of Hellas, there would be an impression of inadequacy. Whereas, if Athens were to suffer the same misfortune, I suppose that any inference from the appearance presented to the eye would make her power to have been twice as great as it is. We have therefore no right to be skeptical, nor to content ourselves with an inspection of a town to the exclusion of a considered of its own power. But we may safely conclude that the armament in question surpassed all before it, as it fell short of modern efforts. If we can here also accept the testimony of Homer's poems, in which, without allowing for the exaggeration which a poet would feel himself licensed to employ, we can see that it was far from equaling ours. He has represented it as consisting of 1,200 vessels, the Boeotian complement of each ship being 120 men, that of the ships of Philoctetes 50. By this I conceive he meant to convey the maximum and the minimum complement. At any rate, he does not specify the amount of any others in his catalogue of the ships. That they were all rowers as well as warriors we see from his account of the ships of Philoctetes, in which all the men at the oar are bowmen. Now it is improbable that many supernumeraries sailed. If we accept the kings and high officers, especially as they had to cross the open sea with munitions of war, in ships, moreover that had no decks but were equipped in the old piratical fashion. So that if we strike the average of the largest and smallest ships, the number of those who sailed will appear inconsiderable, representing, as they did, the whole force of Hellas. And this was due not so much to scarcity of men as of money. Difficulty of subsistence made the invaders reduce the number of the army to a point at which it might live on the country during the prosecution of the war. Even after the victory they obtained on their arrival, and a victory there must have been, or the fortifications of the naval camp could never have been built, there is no indication of their whole force having been employed. On the contrary, they seem to have turned to cultivation of the Chersonese and to piracy from want of supplies. This was what really enabled the Trojans to keep the field for 10 years against them, the dispersion of the enemy making them always a match for the detachment left behind. If they had brought plenty of supplies with them, and had persevered in the war without scattering for piracy and agriculture, they would have easily defeated the Trojans in the field, since they could hold their own against them with the division of service. In short, if they had stuck to the siege, the capture of Troy would have cost them less time and less trouble. But as want of money proved the weakness of earlier expeditions, so from the same cause, even the one in question, more famous than its predecessors, may be pronounced on the evidence of what it effected to have been inferior to its renown, and to the current opinion about it formed under the tuition of the poets. Even after the Trojan War, Hellas was still engaged in removing and settling, and thus could not attain to the quiet which must precede growth. The late return of the Hellenes from Ilium caused many revolutions, and factions ensued almost everywhere, and it was the citizens thus driven into exile who founded the cities. 60 years after the capture of Ilium, the modern Boeotians were driven out of Arni by the Thessalians and settled in the present Boeotia, the former Cadmes, though there was a division of them left there before, some of whom joined the expedition to Ilium. 20 years later, the Dorians and the Heraclids became masters of Peloponnese, so that much had to be done and many years had to elapse before Hellas could attain to a durable tranquility undisturbed by removals, and could begin to send out colonies, as Athens did to Ionia and most of the islands, and the Peloponnesians to most of Italy and Sicily, and some places in the rest of Hellas. All these places were founded subsequently to the war with Troy. But as the power of Hellas grew and the acquisition of wealth became more an object, the revenues of the states increasing, tyrannies were by their means established almost everywhere. The old form of government being hereditary monarchy with definite prerogatives, and Hellas began to fit out fleets and apply herself more closely to the sea. It is said that the Corinthians were the first to approach the modern style of naval architecture, and that Corinth was the first place in Hellas where galleys were built. And we have in Maniacles a Corinthian shipwright making 4 ships for the Samians. Dating from the end of this war, it is nearly 300 years ago that Maniacles went to Samos. Again, the earliest sea fight in history was between the Corinthians and the Corcyraeans. This was about 260 years ago, dating from the same time. Planted on an isthmus, Corinth had from time out of mind been a commercial emporium, as formerly almost all communication between the Hellenes within and without Peloponnese was carried on over land, and Corinthian territory was the highway through which it traveled. She had consequently great money resources, and is shown by the epithet wealthy, bestowed by the old poets on the place, and this enabled her, when traffic by sea became more common, to procure her navy and put down piracy, and she could offer a mart for both branches of the trade. She acquired for herself all the power which a large revenue affords. Subsequently, the Ionians attained to the great naval strength in the reign of Cyrus, the first king of the Persians, and of his son Cambyses, and while they were at war with the former, commanded for a while the Ionian Sea. Polycrates also, the tyrant of Samos, had a powerful navy in the reign of Cambyses, with which he reduced many of the islands, and among them Rhenea, which he consecrated to the Delian Apollo. About this time also the Phaeacians, while they were founding Marseille, defeated the Carthaginians in a sea fight. These were the most powerful navies, and even these, although so many generations had elapsed since the Trojan War, seem to have been principally composed of the old 50 oars and longboats, and to have counted few galleys among their ranks. Indeed, it was only shortly the Persian War and the death of Darius, the successor of Cambyses, that the Sicilian tyrants and the Corcyraeans acquired any large number of galleys. For after these, there were no navies of any account in Hellas till the expedition of Xerxes. Aegina, Athens, and others may have possessed a few vessels, but they were principally 50 oars. It was quite at the end of this period that the war with Aegina and the prospect of the barbarian invasion enabled Themistocles to persuade the Athenians to build the fleet with which they fought at Salamis, and even these vessels had not complete decks. The navies, then, of the Hellenes during the period we have traversed were what I have described. All their insignificance did not prevent there being an element of the greatest power to those who cultivated them, alike in revenue and in dominion. They were the means by which the islands were reached and reduced, those of the smallest area falling the easiest prey. Wars by land there were none at least by which power was acquired. We have the usual border contests, but of distant expeditions with conquest for object we hear nothing among the Hellenes. There was no union of subject cities round a great state, no spontaneous combination of equals for confederate expeditions. What fighting there was consisted merely of local warfare between rival neighbors. The nearest approach to a coalition took place in the old war between Chalcis and Eretria. This was a quarrel in which the rest of the Hellenic name did to some extent take sides. Well, nerds, that was most of Chapter 1, Book 1 of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. It goes into a little bit more, but we're looking deeper at the Persian Wars, which, of course, they had a much better grasp on the actual historicity and the archaeology associated, because the Persian Wars were like 100 years before Thucydides, maybe less. I'm not going to look at a timeline because this is ostensibly still about the Bronze Age. But I'm just utterly fascinated with how Thucydides is showing us this really, really interesting combination of what we now know to be fairly reasonably true history, combining it, blending it with this epic history that is the Homeric epics. You know, to the classical Greeks and the Greeks that came before them, the epics were what they knew of their written history. It was the only grasp they really had because, of course, as we looked at in such detail, there was this loss, quote-unquote loss, of the earlier languages used in the Bronze Age. Again, it wasn't really a loss so much as those writing systems, Linear A and Linear B, served a very specific purpose that just no longer existed after the collapse of the Bronze Age, and so the use of the writing just died out. Before, a few hundred years later, we get the introduction of the Greek alphabet, again, from the Levant, from the south, where they are establishing this new alphabet. And as we talked about in the conversation episodes, like, we're seeing a lot of playing with what letters are coming out, what they're actually going to finalize their alphabet as, because they're introducing this brand new alphabet and figuring things out. And then so, like us, one of the earliest forms of this usage that then, a few hundred more years later, somebody like Thucydides has access to is going to be Homer, right? It is like, not only as a written source, we can't really presume that he was reading a written source of Homer, like Joel Christensen went into great detail on my show. What we know is that somebody like Thucydides, really any Athenian, any probably in a larger area of the Greece, but we are working with Athens in this case, they're going to know the Homeric epics as told by these poets as their own kind of oral epic history. It's just the assumption that, like, because they align with the modern areas and they tell this epic history, like, of course it is going to be the historical narrative that then later Greeks attach to their own, history. And for all intents and purposes, it is history to them. It's only much later that we are able to look and see, like in that conversation, how we looked at just exactly how the Iliad and the Odyssey, certainly as least as we have them, are really interacting with the Archaic period, the Classical period, like, where they really are not necessarily history so much as this kind of way of understanding what was left behind by those Bronze Age people. But somebody like Thucydides, this Athenian who is facing down what seems like it's going to be an incredibly big war, you know, ostensibly against Sparta, but really we're talking like a war, like he's saying, like he is using this introduction to the war that his people are facing in that moment. He's using this introduction of like the time before the Hellenes became unified as these Greek people. You know, the Trojan War is his example of how that started to happen, how it became that all of these people associated themselves with this Hellenic culture, this Hellenic tradition, and then formed, you know, all of the different city-states, but would ultimately become, you know, the Athens and Sparta of it all fighting each other. It's just this utterly incredible way of looking at how history was perceived historically. How somebody 2,500 years ago understood the history of his people from 1,000 years before him. Like, it just has so many levels. I just think it's such a particularly interesting way of looking at both the Bronze Age and classical Athens, like, squished into one. Basically, it's aligning everything I love, because archaic and classical Greece is my time period of obsession, but also Homer, and thus its connections with this perceived history of the Bronze Age. And what a joy. I cannot believe I just read 4,000 words of Thucydides on this show and actually liked it. Thanks, Thucydides. Honestly, that was so much fun. Thank you all for listening. Just thought it was a great way to kind of cap off this series. That said, over the next week, I guess, trying to remember what I've planned. Over the next week, there are going to be some re-aired episodes. Michaela went back and looked at a lot of the earlier myths that I had covered on the show that have these connections to the Bronze Age, you know, myths like those on Crete and the origins of the Minoans and then the Trojan War and the installment of Mycenae and Sparta and things like this. These mythologies that, again, are coming from the archaic period, but are, you know, intentionally looking to what they believed the Bronze Age was, or rather this earlier time that we would now, you know, kind of associate with the Bronze Age. So we're just going to be re-airing some of those little bits and pieces. There's also a playlist of all the Bronze Age related kind of episodes that Michaela put together. That's all linked in the episode's description. But frankly, we're doing that so that I can actually take a week of not working, because if I'm just being so honest, I had a full anxiety meltdown and am now trying to figure out how to exist as a person and also figure out how to get back on my ADHD medication so that I can function as a human. So I'm taking a week off. And I'm excited about it. That was so much fun. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop talking now. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians, my assistant producer, who basically gave me the idea to read the Thucydides, wrote all the scripts for the Bronze Age episodes, couldn't have done it without her. She's an absolute queen. Laura Smith is the production assistant and audio engineer who worked tirelessly on all of the conversations for the Bronze Age series and all conversations broadly. Laura is a gem. Select music in this episode was by Luke Chaos. The podcast is part of the iHeart Podcast Network. Listen on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. Help me continue bringing you this incredible content by donating to the show via Patreon. That's patreon.com/mythsbaby. You get access to loads of past episodes I've been doing over the past 7 years and hopefully more soon once I get myself in check. I am Liv, and I love this shit, and I'm excited to breathe for a couple of days. Thank you all for coming along on this Bronze Age ride. It has been an absolute thrill, and I can't wait to get back to some mythological roots. I already said that I am Liv. That's how well this is going. I'm Liv and I love this shit. I don't know how many times I've said it. It's done now. Bye. Thanks.